Today's Religion Media Centre briefing is on the report into the Grenfell Tower fire in West London, in which 72 people died. This was in June 2017. The report was a devastating critique, calling out systematic dishonesty, decades of failure by the government, and the way that commercial interests were put above building safety. And within the 7-volume report, it describes the substantial involvement of faith and community organisations, which provided sanctuary and support at the time. And it described this as the best in humanity. It also highlighted the way that Muslims felt ignored by the council, particularly as the event happened during Ramadan. So joining us to discuss the report, we have Bishop Graham Tomlin, the former Bishop of Kensington, Abdurrahman Saeed, the CEO of Al-Manar, the Muslim Cultural and Heritage Centre, the Reverend Alan Everett, the former vicar of St Clement's Church in Notting Hill, and author of a book, After the Fire, which he wrote about his experiences of dealing with the tragedy. And there are various other contributors on the call, I know, who want to get involved in the discussion as we go. But first of all, Alan, I wonder if I could start with you. You were the vicar of St Clement's Church, Notting Hill, which was round the corner from the Grenfell Tower, I believe. And you were woken in the night on Wednesday, the 14th of June, 2017. And you went into the church and you described that nobody knew what the extent was of the fire when you went into the church. I wonder if you could tell us, as you read the report or have read snatches of it in the papers today, was there anything in the way that the report told the story that surprised you about its conclusions of the extent of the failures?
Not at all. I think those of us who were involved are very pleased that the report's conclusions seem to be so thorough. And no, it is a devastating indictment of the factors that led up to the fire. From my perspective, as the parish priest, Anglican parish priest at the time, completely accurate.
Were you waiting for the report to be written? Were you amongst those who said they were waiting for it so that they could begin to start the grieving process? Was there anything significant for you about the fact that it's been published for the first time?
I have to be honest and say I left the parish after 2 years. I left in 2019. And so my direct involvement has gradually declined over the years. I'm now retired. And I think what's surprising for me was just, and I'm speaking obviously from somebody who's speaking at some distance now from events, and was just what a difficult day yesterday was. It was a very important day, and yes, people have been waiting for a very, very long time, and the wait has been extremely painful. But there was, for me, and I'm sure for many other people, there was a huge feeling of relief that at last the report has come out, and that it has been so comprehensive. And, of course, that raises all sorts of questions about next steps. But at least we now have a statement which fully encapsulates the terrible things that have happened leading us to the fire, and the appalling complicity across so many organisations, including government, in the events that led up to the fire, and the appalling mismanagement of the fire directly afterwards, the consequences of the fire.
Thank you. Can I bring in Abdurrahman Saeed, the CEO of Al-Manar, the Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre in Notting Hill now. Abdurrahman, do you agree with what Alan has just said there? Was there a sense of anticipation for you waiting for this report to be written, and a sense of relief that it has been published?
I think it's very important that it has been published, and I do agree. It highlights some of the very important issues that has been in the mind of everyone, really, because the failure was really witnessed right from the first hours of the fire, and therefore it was not something that was not known to the community and to those who were victimized by the incident itself. But it's good that it has been highlighted at this level. And I hope the report would now lead to more steps in terms of addressing the issue of justice, because that is very much linked to closure for very many families. They're waiting to see the upholding of justice, especially around those who are responsible for any kind of negligence that resulted in the deaths of so many lives that could have been saved. But this is not only about individuals, it could also be around issues of institutional failures. And I'm glad like institutions like the London Fire Brigade have taken steps. They didn't wait for this report to come out. And they've been trying to address the failures and also review their existing policies and procedures, which is really good. But we do hope that to happen also across the board, including the local authority and the national authorities when it comes to cladding and the related issues. In terms of the final outcome, I think the bereaved will still want to see more than just a report. So what follows now is going to be really in the minds of everyone, whether there will be any criminal prosecution and any highlighting of the last 7 years, and if any of the issues have been addressed and so on by the institutions responsible for housing and housing management. This all remains to be seen.
There were 80% of those who died were Muslims, it said. And the report said that there was a feeling amongst the Muslim communities around Grenfell that they'd been abandoned by the local authority, and it was into this vacuum that the faith and community organisations leapt. Do you recognise that feeling?
Certainly, there has been a feeling of neglect, whether that is because they were 80% Muslims or because they were from a poorer part of the Kensington and Chelsea. That could be quite subjective, and it requires more maybe evidence. But in general, the community of North Kensington, which is economically one of the most deprived areas in the UK, has always felt the neglect. So regardless of faith or ethnicity, there has been that feeling across the community. The other issue is the fire safety procedures that was in place. There were some complaints around it. Reports were made even before the fire, but it did not. It was not.
Since the report has been published, what's the response of the Muslim community near Grenfell, would you say? Do they feel abandoned still? Do they feel neglected? Or has this report addressed some of those concerns?
The feeling of neglect, as I said, it's across the board, and it remains until we see some kind of justice taking place, but also addressing the shortcomings of those days and prior to the fire have been addressed. I think most of that have not been addressed. So that's one issue that everyone feels about, unhappy and uncomfortable. In terms of the response to the report, I think the report has just been out since yesterday, but the general feeling there is still more to be done. This is not really the end. Yes, the phase 2 report of the inquiry might be the final one, but the case of Grenfell and the issue of negligence and all the associated issues have not been addressed yet. So they need to be addressed sooner or later. But definitely there will be people waiting now to see agencies like the police and others coming forward and taking the pieces from this report and then following it up through the legal process.
Thank you. Bishop Graham Tomlin, you were Bishop of Kensington at the time of the fire, and you were visible. You were interviewed so many times by the media as in front of churches, with the community as volunteers rallied round. You've written already, since the report has been published, about its You said it was devastating and brutal. You said words like failure, dishonesty, misleading and defective sound like a tolling bell. I wonder if you, on reflection, looking at the report, how do you view the overwhelming failures of every organisation in society, that no one put their hand up to voice any concern or stop any of this? How do you explain that?
I think that is one of the remarkable things about the report. I mean, what says the report says nothing we didn't know already, because it's been a public inquiry. A lot of the evidence has been out in the public. And so for many of those of us who've been following this story, it doesn't say anything new. But what it does do is it lays out in very strong terms the kind of extent of the complicity of all kinds of organizations in this: national government, local government, the construction industry, the TMO, everybody. And I suppose my reflection on it is that it's kind of the way in which these things work. It wasn't just one individual, one decision. And in some ways, we kind of like to be able to do that sometimes, to identify here's the one terrible person who caused this. Now, actually, it was individuals caught up in a culture which had become systematic. I mean, as the report says, it was incompetence, dishonesty, and greed, ranging from incompetence at one level to active greed at the other. And I suppose that the way I interpret that is to say that if, again, from a Christian religious point of view, Jesus spoke about the two great commandments, to love God and to love our neighbor. And what happens when you actually displace those commands with other commands, like, to increase market share for your company, to maximize profit, to protect the reputation of your institution. And when the call to love your neighbor begins to get relegated in comparison to those things, then this kind of culture begins to develop. And so it seems to be we've had a sort of systemic culture here of other things becoming more important than that simple call to actively seek the welfare of our neighbor. And this is what has happened as a result of it. And I think something like this, the Grenfell Tower fire, the report itself, is a bit of a shock to the system. It gives us the opportunity to kind of think, actually, do we want this kind of culture in our society more generally? It's a wider issue than just Grenfell itself. And so that's, again, some of the ways in which I try to make sense of it.
How would you achieve that? I mean, there's talk at the moment about retribution, punishment, manslaughter charges, which may take a year or so to come in. You can't legislate for a change in society such as the one you just described.
Exactly right. I think it's a wider than just a political issue. There are political aspects to it. The report has an extensive section at the end of recommendations, which is going to take years, possibly even decades, to kind of put into place, and that needs to happen. We need to move towards the kind of police investigation, the Crown Prosecution Service, that will presumably, we expect, bring about prosecutions. And I think that's important, not so much in terms of retribution or vengeance, but in terms of a process of healing for those who have been affected by this. So it seems to me there's a kind of stage in which that healing takes place. I mean, I was earlier this year, I was at an event called the Grenfell Testimony Week, which is a remarkable time when survivors and bereaved families were invited to tell their story in the presence of representatives of the companies that were named yesterday, companies like Arconic and Kingspan and Celotex and Ryden. And what struck me about that was that the emotions are still very raw for those people. It's really not healed at all. And it seems to me that there's an important process that, having experienced that the telling of the truth is an important part of that healing. And that's what we saw yesterday. This sort of exercise in truth-telling. There's then a process whereby those who are guilty are made to face up to what they've done and hopefully express their own penitence of it. There's then a process, I think, beyond that of people finding some element of kind of healing and peace as a result of it. I think that can only come through the telling of the truth, the establishment of justice, and then finding peace. And you can't get to peace without those things, the telling of the truth and the finding of justice. And this is a stage in the journey. I think, as Abdul Rahman has said, it's not the end of it, but I think it's an important stage in that journey.
At the time of the Grenfell Tower, there was a massive collaborative effort amongst all the faith groups to help people who had nothing when they came out. And I wonder if we could just talk about that for a moment here. The report said that the groups concerned were the best of humanity. And in a documents such as you've been describing, Bishop, which was devastating and in its critique, it was like a kind of chink of light to see that towards the end of the volumes that this had been noted. I wonder if we could just talk about how that happened and what lessons you have as faith leaders as to the tips for faith leaders trying to work together in collaboration on something like this. I mean, Alan, for you, when you described it in your book, it just seemed like a gut instinct. You didn't really know what you were going to expect. You just drove towards it.
That's right. I was woken up shortly before 3:00 in the morning and by a fellow priest who happened to live near the tower. And we just walked up the road, reached St. Clement's Church around 3:00 in the morning. And there it was, the fire. It was just indescribable on the scale of it. I couldn't really take it in. It was so terrifying and so terrible, so traumatic for those people who, there were so many people who were transfixed, who could not move away from this appalling sight.
How did you get in touch with all the other faith leaders at the time? You were there in your church. Were people milling around in the street, or were there phone calls? What happened?
Well, nothing happened straight away because, well, the first thing the two of us did, this other priest, Sean Doherty, and myself, was we tried to find an evacuation centre. We walked around for a bit, couldn't find one. So we wanted to join in with a broader effort, but everything was very, very fragmented. There was a palpable sense of chaos and disorientation on the streets. So I went back to the church, which I previously opened. I turned on the lights and opened the doors, and there were people already gathering in the church, people coming in, volunteers bringing in water and food, and people seeking shelter. And over the next hour or so, the church became full. And so our response, I think each individual one of us in our different places were just really trying to respond to the situation that we found on the ground, which was people flooding in. And of course, it was a combination of people seeking shelter, absolutely, but also it was volunteers. So these places, these buildings, these places of worship with their deep roots in the community became natural focal points, receptacles, really, both for people in dire need, but also people wanting to help. And so really, it was just a question of navigating your way along with that, with all that energy. And we really didn't have time to think about it.
And was it the same for you, Abdul Rahman, at your centre as well, the same kind of experience? Because you said you lived was it you that lived in East London and then you drove across London, not knowing what to expect? And did people flood into your centre as well? Is that what happened?
Absolutely. That's exactly what happened. There was first, initially, in fact, as Father Alan said, I tried to identify the exact location of the building and then drove my car loaded with water and dates because it was a fasting month for us. So we were on the 19th month of the fasting month. So I approached the Methodist church there, and it was a quite chaotic scene, but also very heart-touching scene because people were coming really with whatever they had to donate and to give to those who needed it. And then when I came back, when I returned to our center for the Almanar, I found the same situation taking place at the Almanar. And from that moment, we just found ourselves being one of the 4 to 5 emergency centers in those days. And it continued ever since then, supporting and working with the survivors and the community at large. In terms of bridging, I think the only bridge we had in those days were the hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers who came from across communities, ethnicities, and faith and other affiliations to the different centers, to the 4 or 5 centers. And then they would tell us what's going on on the other side, and so on. So they were the only really source of information. Apart from that, there was a huge lack of coordination and leadership in those days. So we had to really do whatever we can. But thank God, the help from the community, the help from the volunteers, the encouraging messages even from across the world. I received messages from America and New Zealand. These are very far places, but also with different time zones. So they were really calling and sending messages. Some of them even sending whatever they had. I remember one retired sports reporter, I think from America, sent me a draft book of his own writing. Another person from Australia sent me a cookbook, and so on. So this really kept us really motivated to do whatever we can, regardless of the absence of leadership and coordination in those days.
How did you deal with that as a leader? This was a very new environment for you. Never had anything on that scale before. What were the challenges for you as a leader?
The first thing, as someone who is affiliated to a faith, and I'm sure many of our faith leaders, in fact, all would agree, the first priority for us was really to support the community that has been affected by the fire. So there wasn't any doubts about that, or ifs and when and so on. We just opened our door and we welcomed and we did everything we can. And I think with God's blessing, all these people, like I was mentioning, the volunteers came forward and helped, really, young and old, as well as men and women. Their support was monumental. The second thing, as a manager, we had to adapt a crisis management approach. So we had to suspend many of our regular activities, including spiritual ones, to prioritize the support, the provision of space, and also the identifying of the needs, because initially there was a talk about material needs like hoses and toiletries and so on. But the emotional need was not something that we took account of immediately. It took us a couple of weeks to look into that, and then set up a therapeutic counseling process, massage therapy, and other sorts of emotional therapies within the center. And from then on, it evolved from one stage of support to the other, to the extent then we found ourselves as faith communities becoming like a bridge between the local authorities, the national authorities, and the emergency services on one side, and then the community on the other side. So we were almost the only safe and trusted platform where the two sides can come with all the anger and the emotional upset and everything, can still engage and talk to one another in a safer platform. And that's what we have ended up being. And we continued, central government ministers, to local government issues, even to the institutions like the London Fire, have been coming to the faith community centers like Al-Manar, St. Clement, the Methodist Church, and others to really engage the community and listen to the community.
It's a story of collaboration. I wonder if there are, big lessons from this for others. And I want to bring in some other people on the call just to address that. Eddie Tulizovic from the National Churches Trust. You've written reports about how buildings of faith organisations can be this bridge, as Abdurrahman was describing there, and a conduit for support. What were the lessons that you can glean from what's just been said by Abdurrahman, from what the work of the centre and how people came together automatically to help and support?
It's noticeable in the report how the local faith buildings are mentioned. St. Clement's Church, the Al-Manar Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre, the Latimer Community Church, St. Francis Assisi Catholic Church, and the Notting Hill Methodist Church. What faith buildings bring are a building, and that's very important, and volunteers. Both are brought, and that's something that Father Allen reflected upon. So all around the UK, there are church buildings and other buildings of other faith. There are 38,500 church buildings. And at times of crisis and of need, those buildings are available. One thinks of floods, civil disasters, and they also are able to adapt very quickly to respond to need. Clearly, the Grenfell disaster, they had to respond immediately, but other things like warm spaces have been set up in churches. They're not sort of bureaucratic organisations where they have to spend 6 months getting approval. They can just get on and do it. So that's the first thing, and I think that's perhaps not widely recognised. What actually happens in these buildings? Of course, prayers are important, but so much else happens in these buildings. And you're right to mention our report, The House of Good. We estimated that the well-being value of these church buildings is around £55 billion a year. The other thing I take away from the report are the statements saying basically that the council had no regard for the cultural and religious needs of the people, and the council had little understanding of the local voluntary groups. And that's something that can be addressed if a council is willing to sort of open up and to say, we're not the experts at everything, we don't have all the people who can do this, and engage with faith communities. Some councils are better at that than others, but there's an opportunity here. I will point people in the direction of the Faith Covenant. That's something that's been set up by Stephen Timms, APPG, in Parliament, and Leeds Council is an example of one that's just adopted that. And that allows councils to have a sort of covenant with faith groups and to reach out and to work more closely together. And I think there's a broader thing here. Obviously, the Grenfell report and the Grenfell disaster makes this crucially clear at a moment of such emergency. But the new government really should be a bit more active in getting local authorities and public groups to engage with faith groups and make more use of the buildings when they're needed, and also of the volunteers, and to be honest, the faith of people and the hope and the prayers that they bring.
There was a statement from Kensington and Chelsea Council after the report was published, apologising unreservedly for everything that had happened before, and saying that justice is still to be served and that Grenfell can never be allowed to happen again. So it's a statement of intent for the future and acknowledgement there. Thanks, Eddie. Can I bring in Abdul Sami Arjumand, I hope I've pronounced that properly, from the Muslim Charities Forum, because you represent, there are hundreds, thousands probably, of Muslim charities all around the UK. What's your knowledge of what happened at Grenfell? We've heard that thousands of people arrived at the church and arrived at the mosque, and people were arriving from all over the UK and sometimes abroad to help. What's your understanding of how a disaster like that brought the charity sector together? Again, Eddie's point was very interesting, that there's no bureaucracy involved. You don't plan for it for 6 months. It just happens. Like journalism, what a big story, I suppose. When it happens, everyone reports it. But yes, just give your reflection, if you would, on what happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. And these issues, these type of problems often put pressure on faith-based organizations and community sector organizations, who are often usually there, just present. That's a real answer. In fact, they are from the same places. Many people who responded, have families, have friends who lived at Grenfell, for example, and they were the ones who were, attending the local mosque, for example, as well. Many of them who prayed the night prayers the night before, who were able to actually help with some of the evacuations that were going on, for example. And that's the first real answer, the fact that they're actually present, they're there, and they're able to respond as quickly as possible. And this is the kind of resilience that we've kind of seen building within kind of local community organizations. And I think just one thing about to touch up on what Eddie's mentioned with regards to how local authorities, and really bridging the gap between local authorities and community sector organizations. It's, some of the research that we've done and some of the work that we're trying to really do is how can we actually help local authorities understand the organizations that are working within them, and how they can actually better allocate resources and just generally speaking have a better relationship to be able to kind of put together some of these things, because there is a massive gap, unfortunately, across various local authorities on that. And I think that's another area of improvement that really needs to happen. And I think one thing I'll just kind of touch up on, which is that I know we've mentioned a lot of things about this report being damning, and but I think it's also it's really a shame in terms of, and we should be looking at this, that it's bringing not just our government, but us as a country to distribute, and really should be reflecting upon how many more flies. I know we've said that, you just mentioned the statement Kensington and Chelsea about saying never again. But the reality is that there have been plentiful of fires, unfortunately, that have happened. Some of them have been mentioned in the report. And not just that, we're still seeing things going on. We've only just seen a couple of, a week back with what's happened in Dagenham. So the reality is, when we say never again, we should put our money where our mouth is and actually heed those warnings. And the recommendations, yes, they'll take time to approve. But I think when it comes to, for example, the next steps in terms of justice, for example, justice isn't for the sake of kind of resentment, but rather as a part of the process of healing process, as part of trying to increase the culture of accountability and the culture of doing what's right as one thing. But I think beyond anything else, it's about how do we genuinely and sincerely make sure that we say that never again, and we're going to implement the recommendations that have been put forward and ensure that it inspires. So I think, those are some kind of initial thoughts.
Thank you. Can I go back to you, Alan, something that you wrote in your book? And you said, on reflection, as you looked at your role in all of this, that you spoke of offering a stress-tested rationale for parish ministry. Just explain to us what that means and how you arrived at that conclusion.
If the churches and Almanar, and if these faith communities weren't there, well, what would the process have been? The Church of England itself is going through a period of reevaluation of its own purpose and meaning within this country, and resources have been ploughed into fairly large, high-profile mission projects, and some of us who've dedicated our lives to parish ministry at times have felt that what we're offering is being in some ways sidelined or undervalued. And of course, it's very easy to undervalue because it goes on below the surface, all this day-to-day contact with people, the support, or the relational side of parish ministry, which happens all the time. And it's very easy to underestimate it and its value and its contribution. And but when a crisis like this occurs, all that has been invested in the local communities comes together. We're trusted agencies in these very stressful situations. People turn to faith communities, as to obviously to other local charities as well. They turn to us because we have that relationship, because we're living among people, alongside people. We've been there supporting them through every aspect of their lives. Obviously, one doesn't do this in order to be there and to get the kudos of your response in a crisis. You just do it because that's what you are called to do as a faith community. You are called to be there in the community alongside people, building those relationships. If that hadn't happened, then we wouldn't be there. We wouldn't be able to give a response. And I think that's what I meant. That's what I meant by it being a stress-tested rationale, because the Church of England is going through this period of reevaluation of what its priorities should be, where it should put its money and things like that. But I think Grenfell really demonstrated the immense value of parishes. And I think really it's very important that church leaders and leaders of other faith groups, it's very important that they're seen in the public square. It's very important that they have some sort of platform to speak to big issues of justice and equality in our society. It's enormously important that people do that. But their mandate for doing that is what happens at ground level in parishes, because they speak from those small local communities and the cumulative effect of all of that.
I just wanted to echo some of the things that Father Alan has been saying. It is a question of resources. I mean, it's not just the Church of England that is considering its future mission, but other Christian denominations, particularly as regard to what's the purpose of parish. Do they need church buildings anymore? And and it's clear that buildings are needed, and church denominations should put their money into those buildings, and so should government, to be honest, because without these buildings, the government would have to spend 10 times as much money to run things, because all this stuff is often provided free or at a low cost in a church building. So keeping these buildings open and in use needs money, and that money should come, I think, from denominations, charities such as ourselves, and the government.
Bishop, I wonder how you reflect on that. Is the report a wake-up call to the church to put its money into parishes and away from these large-scale mission programmes?
I think Alan makes a very strong point about the value of the parish system, and in some ways, it's the kind of thing that if you didn't have it, you certainly want to invent it. It struck me later on that same summer. You may remember a couple of months after Grenfell, there was the Parsons Green bombing attack, and I remember being there and meeting many of the same emergency services, and because it was in my episcopal area, many of the same sort of the police, the ambulance people, the kind of emergency services were there, as were at Grenfell, and seeing the same faces. And it struck me at the time that, again, the local parish church had opened its doors and began to be a place where people could drop in and have a cup of coffee and just kind of gather themselves while this thing was happening. And it struck me how every single square inch of this country is covered by a parish and other religious communities as well. And so you've got that as a local immediate response to things like that. Same time as that, I think, one of the things I was reflecting on our discussion, one of the other things I think the religious communities did was to provide not just sort of practical space, but sacred space. And so the churches and the mosques and others were able to provide a place and kind of host a place where the grief of people could be held and expressed, and if you like, held within that kind of wider presence of God. And for that, you need parish churches, but you also need some of the larger places as well. We held the 6-month anniversary service, or the 6-month service of remembrance, national service of remembrance in St. Paul's Cathedral. You kind of need some of those bigger spaces as well as the local parish things as well. So I think it is a kind of more it's a nuanced picture. We desperately need that parish system to be strong, to be resourced, but we also need that kind of wider picture of maybe larger churches, larger spaces that are complementary to the kind of local bedrock of the Church of England and the faith communities around the country to make this thing work.
Thank you. Just picking up what you were saying there about the listening ear provided as people came in while it was all happening, and bringing into the conversation Nazima Khanum. You were a psychotherapist at the Al-Manar Centre during the fire, and you were offering support to families, presumably mainly Muslim families who came into the cultural centre. But just tell me a little bit about the work that you did there and how it was possible to offer support and comfort within what must have been a very bustling area with people very distressed at the time.
Greetings of God's peace to you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Yes, so it's really everything that Bishop Graham, Alan and others have spoke, Eddie, quite profound with Abdul Rahman also, of course, there as somebody who I work with very closely, and really proud of the work that we've did together on the ground, responding to unprecedented crisis. You have to also contextualize the comment that you made earlier, Ruth, both two aspects that I want to pick on. The best of humanity that report identified in terms of how the faith group have came together. I think that's something that we can be proud of and actually need to, as I think Eddie or Alan was saying about faith groups are not add-on. They're in the heart of the community. In fact, they're crucial and central part of the work, and we need to reflect on the learning from and lessons from that. And best of humanity concept, which is very universal, where all people responded with the tragedy and the visual image of the fire. I attended as a volunteer. I was also called, was working across 2 miles down from Al-Manar, another mosque in central London in Camden, where I work and deliver my community practice. What I want to highlight is that the Islamic principle of which Bishop highlighted, that, the best of humanity is the one who is good to one's neighbor. The same principle, we have this in Islam. Also, which is, I think, what underpinning the philosophy that drove the Muslims in that particular month. But I'm not just talking about Muslim. I met and came across people of Christian, Jewish, Hindu, and all other faith or no faith who came on a primordial level, which Islam also recognizes another concept called fitra, which is the innate goodness in humanity to respond to tragedy. And we saw the best of humanity in that, in people of all faith. And in my psychotherapy space, by the way, it was not just Muslims who came to see me for my one-to-one work. I had non-Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jewish client coming to see me. In my coffee morning, women who were not Muslim were there, as well as in my one-to-one individual, which was really absolutely confounded me, because I hadn't expected that. I did ask them, how come you're coming to, what draws you? And they've all said, I have Muslim in the community. I know them. I see the respect from each other that you demonstrate. And I feel you will listen, because I come from a faith and I've not had people who could integrate faith into that. So I've had people who are non-Muslims. I think that's something to highlight.
Can I just talk to you about the work that you did at the time, and perhaps people that you may still be in contact with? And what difference will this report make on those feelings that you've just been describing that were raw in the moment, the abandonment, the way that they felt ignored, neglected, that the council didn't take any account of Muslims at all? How will this report have helped that?
Well, it's a really good question. I think it's a complex response to that. I think on one level, absolutely, it's what they've been waiting for. I'm in touch with some of the volunteers, some of the family members who experienced the loss and grief. There is a however. There is a however, meaning, will things transform into action behind those words? What action could we see? And it isn't just that we're and the community is seeking about the Grenfell. It's a wider human, as a spiritual Muslim, wider human question that I think Abdul Sami talked about. What are the lessons we have learned, and how is that translating universally to UK and wider? So I think there is a profound question that we're all waiting for the new government to see how they and others take this forward. It's definitely positive, but I think given that the failure has been so systematic, as the report said, systematic dishonesty, you could not get profound in those words. People will naturally be reserved and cautious and will wait, because they had compounded multiple failures, chronic failures and ongoing systematic failures. And so this is just one milestone on the journey, a long journey.
Thank you very much indeed. I think as we draw this session to a close, perhaps I could go to Abdul Rahman and then to you, Bishop, and ask you the same question, really. We've been talking about the action that the government may take. We've talked about the lessons that are there for leaders of the various faith groups. For you personally, how will this report change the way that you view the work of your centre, your church in the community? Perhaps I go to you, Abdul Rahman, first, and then to you, Bishop.
I think the report is a very important document to keep as a reference, and also to highlight its findings as well as recommendations, which are quite extensive. But the most important, and we've been saying this for the last 7 years, is really to have a proper critical evaluation of all the institutions involved in the Grenfell case, but also beyond, if necessary. The second thing is the mapping exercise, and I know my colleagues from, I think, Father Allen and others were mentioning the role of the faith community is always undervalued and not recognized. And I think it's about time that is changing too. And the relationship, not only within the community sector or the faith sector, but also between the faith sector and the community and the institutions, statutory sector institutions, that is, has to be more of a strategic one rather than a transactional one, which is always the case. I was mentioning a few days ago about the counseling service that Nasima was talking about. That's the most under-resourced. But when people talk about recovery strategy, you cannot have a proper recovery strategy without having the issues of therapy addressed as well. And if that's not taken seriously and invested in, we may not have the recovery strategy implemented effectively. So those are the kind of like relationship of a strategy of partnership should be one of those areas that should come out from this report, and everyone should recognize and work for.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Abdurrahman says. He always speaks with a great deal of wisdom, and I think what he said has been very helpful. I think, as he says, I think one of the things that this report brings home to us again is the significance of local faith communities, which I think, as we've said a number of times during our conversation, has often been sidelined and not appreciated. And it's good to see the report actually recognizing that. And so hopefully that will bring a kind of renewed confidence to local faith communities that we do have a significant role to play in our communities, not just at times of crisis like this, but as Alan's been pointing out as well, in the kind of ordinary course of life, the significance of both buildings, faith communities, and worship. I think the second thing is that what we can do is to point up the kind of spiritual dimensions of some of these issues. We're not politicians. That's not our job. The job of the politicians is to kind of exercise and to put in place all the political elements. We are spiritual communities that draw a bigger frame of reference to this, and therefore it seems to me that one of the things we can do as the Christian church, but also other faith communities as well, is to draw attention to the spiritual dimensions of the kind of crisis we face as a nation, both culturally and socially as well as practically as well. That this is actually about how we care for one another and how we love our neighbor, and that is a spiritual issue as much as it is a political one. And so helping to interpret these things in the light of that kind of wider theological and spiritual issues, I think that's something that we particularly have a role to do.
Thank you. And thank you all very much for joining the briefing today. Hope to see you again at the next one. Thank you.